I should have known that death was not the end when the roses in Eleanor's garden bloomed out of season, their petals falling like tears upon the frost-covered ground. The morning I arrived at Ravenshollow Manor, the very air seemed to whisper secrets that the living were not meant to hear. The hired carriage had been traveling for hours through the desolate Yorkshire countryside, its wheels grinding against roads turned treacherous by autumn rains. I pressed my gloved fingers against the cold window pane, watching the landscape transform from rolling green hills to something far more forbidding. Ancient oak trees lined the final approach to the estate, their gnarled branches reaching across the narrow lane like arthritic fingers, grasping for something forever beyond their reach. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of storms that seemed perpetually about to break, but never quite delivered their fury. When Ravenshollow Manor finally emerged from the mist, my breath caught in my throat. The imposing Gothic structure rose from the earth like something conjured from a particularly dark fairy tale, its stone facade blackened by decades of Yorkshire weather and industrial soot carried on the wind from distant mills. Towers and spires pierced the sullen sky with architectural defiance, while rows of tall windows stared out from the building like hollow eyes that had witnessed too much sorrow to ever again reflect joy. Through the rain-streaked carriage window, I caught my first glimpse of the man who had summoned me from London with nothing more than a brief, formal letter requesting a governess for his young daughter. The Duke of Ravenshollow stood motionless in the grand doorway, framed by massive stone columns that seemed to dwarf even his considerable height. His tall frame was draped in black mourning clothes, so complete and unrelieved that he appeared to absorb what little light the cloudy afternoon offered. Even from the considerable distance of the circular drive, I could see the weight of grief etched into his features, transforming what must have once been a remarkably handsome face into a mask of such profound sorrow that it made my heart ache with recognition. I clutched my small leather traveling bag closer to my chest, feeling the familiar flutter of nervous anticipation that had become my constant companion since accepting this position. The bag contained everything I owned in the world now, a collection of belongings so meager they would have fit comfortably in a child's toy box. After losing my own family to the cholera outbreak that had swept through Birmingham like the angel of death, I had wandered from household to household, caring for other people's children while trying desperately to forget the laughter that would never again fill my own nursery. Perhaps it was this shared understanding of devastating loss that had drawn me to respond to the Duke's advertisement, though I could not have anticipated the strange and unsettling circumstances that would soon unfold within these ancient walls. The carriage lurched to a halt with a grinding of wheels against gravel, and I heard the driver's boots hit the ground with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the vast courtyard. Before I could gather my composure, the carriage door swung open, and I found myself stepping down into the chill October air. The scent that greeted me was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a complex mixture of autumn decay, ancient stone, and something else entirely, something sweet and haunting that I would later come to recognize as the ghostly perfume of roses that should not have been blooming in such weather. The butler who met me at the massive oak doors was a gaunt man whose name I learned was Hartwell. His pale blue eyes held the kind of secrets that come from decades of faithful service to a family whose private tragedies far exceeded what any servant should be forced to witness. Those eyes seemed to look straight through me as he performed the necessary courtesies, as if he were seeing not the living woman before him, but some echo of sorrows past. He led me through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, generations of Ashworth nobility, whose painted eyes followed my movement with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The manor felt oppressively quiet, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for some momentous event that might never come to pass. Every footstep on the polished marble floors seemed to echo with supernatural resonance, each sound carrying far longer than physics should have allowed. Suits of medieval armor stood at attention in shadowed alcoves, their empty helmets tilted at angles that suggested they were listening to conversations taking place in rooms both far away and long ago. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes and biblical tableaux hung from the walls, their rich colors faded by time and candlelight into something that spoke more of death than of the vibrant life they had once been meant to celebrate. My chambers were located in the east wing of the manor, a comfortable suite that Hartwell explained had been prepared specifically for my arrival. The rooms were furnished with obvious care and considerable expense, though everything was draped in the same atmosphere of melancholy that seemed to permeate the entire house. Heavy brocade curtains in deep burgundy hung from tall windows that offered a view of the gardens, where Eleanor's roses still bloomed in defiant contradiction to the season. Hartwell informed me, in his careful, measured tones, that I would meet Lady Catherine, the Duke's 5-year-old daughter, the following morning, and that His Grace preferred to take his meals in solitude. The unspoken message was clear as crystal. I was to keep to my designated spaces and ask no questions about the family's private sorrows. That first evening, as I unpacked my few belongings by the flickering light of candles that seemed determined to cast dancing shadows into every corner of the room, I heard it for the first time. The sound drifted through the walls like a melody carried on an impossibly gentle breeze, a woman's voice humming a lullaby I did not recognize, but that somehow struck me as achingly familiar. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a tenderness that spoke of maternal love and devastating loss in equal measure. I pressed my ear to the papered wall, straining to locate the source of this ethereal music, but the humming ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind only the ordinary sounds of an old house settling into night. The silence that followed was somehow more unsettling than the mysterious song had been. It was the kind of complete quiet that feels alive with potential, as if the very air is waiting for permission to breathe again. I found myself holding my own breath, listening with every fiber of my being for some indication that I had not imagined the entire experience. But the only sounds that came were the familiar ones of settling timber, the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the house's depths, and the soft whisper of wind against window panes. Sleep eluded me entirely that first night at Ravenshollow Manor. I lay beneath the heavy brocade coverlet, every sense hyper-aware of my surroundings, listening to the wind rattle the casement windows and wondering what manner of household I had entered. Somewhere in the darkness beyond my door, a grandfather clock chimed the hours with solemn precision, marking time in a house where time seemed to have stopped altogether on the day its mistress drew her final breath. Between those measured chimes, I could have sworn I heard other sounds. The rustle of silk skirts moving through distant corridors, the soft click of heeled slippers on marble floors, the whisper of a woman's voice, speaking words I could not quite discern. When morning finally came, pale and hesitant through the tall windows, I dressed carefully in my best gray wool gown and prepared to meet my young charge. The fabric was serviceable rather than fashionable, marking me clearly as what I was: a woman of education but little means, dependent upon the charity of others for both employment and shelter. I arranged my dark hair in the severe style appropriate to my station, though I could not help but notice how the mirror seemed to reflect not just my own image but shadows that moved independently in the corners of the room. Lady Catherine was to be found in the nursery on the 3rd floor. Hartwell had informed me the previous evening, though he had cautioned that the child had been unusually withdrawn since her mother's passing 6 months prior. As I climbed the narrow servants' staircase, my footsteps echoing in the confined space with an almost musical quality, I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed by eyes I could not see. The sensation was not threatening exactly, but it was deeply unsettling in its persistence and intensity. The nursery wing occupied an entire floor of the manor's eastern tower, a series of rooms that had clearly been designed with both luxury and practicality in mind. Tall windows filled the space with natural light, while child-sized furniture and carefully chosen toys created an environment that should have been welcoming and cheerful. Instead, the rooms felt oddly hollow, as if all the joy had been systematically drained from them, leaving behind only the physical shell of what childhood happiness should look like. The nursery door stood slightly ajar when I reached it, and through the gap I could hear the soft murmur of a child's voice engaged in what sounded like earnest conversation. I knocked gently before entering, expecting to find Lady Catherine playing with dolls or perhaps reciting lessons to herself as many solitary children do. Instead, I discovered a beautiful little girl with dark ringlets that caught the morning light like silk, and her father's penetrating gray eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. She was seated at a small mahogany table that had been set for tea with exquisite attention to detail. Across from her sat an empty chair, though a second cup had been carefully placed and filled with what appeared to be nothing more than air. The child's posture was perfectly erect, her small hands folded in her lap with the kind of careful propriety that spoke of intensive training in social graces. She wore a black mourning dress that matched her father's attire, the somber color making her pale skin appear almost translucent. When she looked up at me, her expression held none of the shyness I might have expected from a child meeting a stranger. Instead, she regarded me with a gravity that was both heartbreaking and deeply unnerving. "Mama always takes her tea with 2 lumps of sugar," Lady Catherine informed me without preamble, her voice carrying the precise diction of a child who has spent considerable time in adult company. "She says I must mind my manners when we have company, even if the company cannot be seen by everyone who might be watching." I felt a chill run down my spine as the little girl lifted the empty teacup to her lips and pretended to sip, her eyes focused on the vacant chair with an intensity that suggested she saw far more than empty space. I introduced myself with as much warmth as I could muster, though my voice trembled slightly as I asked about her invisible tea companion. Lady Catherine regarded me with the terrible solemnity of a child who has been forced to grow up far too quickly, her small face grave as she explained that Mama came to visit sometimes, especially when Papa was too sad to read bedtime stories or when the house felt particularly cold and lonely. The way she spoke of her deceased mother, with such matter-of-fact acceptance, sent ice through my veins and awakened memories of my own childhood encounters with things that should not have been possible, but somehow were. As the days passed in careful routine, I began to settle into the rhythms of life at Ravenshollow Manor, though I could never quite shake the sensation that the house itself was alive with memories and unfinished business. Lady Catherine proved to be an exceptionally intelligent and eager student, her quick mind absorbing lessons with the kind of hunger that comes from too much solitude and too little intellectual stimulation. Yet she possessed the deeply unsettling habit of pausing mid-sentence during our studies to listen to voices that only she could hear, her head tilted at an angle of perfect attention as if receiving instructions from sources invisible to adult eyes. During our morning lessons in the sun-filled morning room, she would suddenly turn toward the tall windows that overlooked the garden and smile with such pure, radiant joy that it transformed her entire countenance. In those moments, she looked exactly like the carefree child she should have been, and she would whisper greetings to her invisible mother in a voice so soft and tender that it broke my heart to witness such devotion to someone who could never respond in any way that the world would recognize as real. The Duke remained an enigmatic and distant figure throughout those early weeks, emerging from his private study only for brief, formal dinners that he took in complete solitude. On the rare occasions when our paths crossed in the manor's labyrinthine corridors, he would nod with scrupulous politeness, but never pause for conversation beyond the most basic courtesies. His grief was a palpable presence that seemed to follow him like a shadow, darkening every room he entered and leaving behind an atmosphere of such profound sadness that it was difficult to breathe normally in his wake. I found myself wondering what manner of love could leave a man so thoroughly broken by its absence. What kind of devotion could transform a powerful duke into a hollow-eyed ghost, haunting his own ancestral halls? The household servants spoke of their master in hushed, reverent tones, their conversations falling silent whenever I approached, but resuming in whispers once they believed themselves unobserved. They spoke of how dramatically he had changed since the Duchess's death, how the man who had once been known for his warmth and generosity had retreated so completely into himself that he seemed to have forgotten how to engage with the world of the living. He no longer rode through the estate, as had been his daily custom, no longer entertained the visitors who had once filled Ravenshollow's halls with laughter and music, no longer seemed to take any pleasure in the vast fortune and social position that should have made him one of England's most enviable men. It was Hartwell who finally provided me with the tragic details surrounding Eleanor's death, though he did so with the greatest reluctance and only after I had been at Ravenshollow for nearly a fortnight. The opportunity presented itself on a particularly stormy evening when the wind howled through the manor's ancient timbers like a chorus of lost souls, and the servants had gathered in the warm kitchen to wait out nature's fury. I had come down seeking a cup of warm milk to help me sleep, as the mysterious sounds that had become my nightly companions were growing more frequent and more distinct with each passing day. We were alone in the vast kitchen, surrounded by copper pots that gleamed like burnished gold in the firelight, and shelves lined with preserves that would never again grace the duchess's table. The old butler's weathered hands trembled slightly as he poured steaming tea into delicate china cups, the ritual providing him with the kind of comfort that comes from performing familiar tasks in the midst of chaos. When I finally summoned the courage to confess my growing concerns about Lady Catherine's conversations with her deceased mother, his pale face grew even more somber, if such a thing were possible. The Duchess fell ill quite suddenly with a fever that baffled Dr. Morrison, our local physician, Hartwell explained in the careful, measured tones of a man who has spent decades guarding family secrets. His Grace had traveled to London on urgent business matters related to his parliamentary duties, and by all accounts, her Grace was in perfect health when he departed. The fever struck without warning on the third day of his absence, progressing with such alarming speed that the household was thrown into complete panic. Within hours, she was delirious, calling out for her husband and begging forgiveness for some perceived transgression that none of us could understand. The butler's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued his terrible narrative. Dr. Morrison tried everything within his considerable knowledge, but the fever consumed her like fire consumes dry kindling. By the time word reached His Grace in London and he could arrange for the fastest possible return to Yorkshire, the Duchess had already slipped into unconsciousness. She died alone, miss, in the early hours of a morning when the roses in her garden bloomed with such impossible beauty that the gardeners spoke of it as either a miracle or an omen. Hartwell's eyes, already pale with age, seemed to lose what little color they possessed as he revealed the most heartbreaking detail of all. The last coherent words Eleanor had spoken were a message for her husband, delivered to the housekeeper with such urgent desperation that the woman had never forgotten a single syllable. She had begged Mrs. Patterson to tell the Duke that she forgave him completely for whatever quarrel had driven him to London, that her love for him transcended any earthly disagreement, and that he must not blame himself for her impending death. But those words of absolution and eternal devotion had arrived too late to provide comfort to the man who needed them most desperately. His Grace blames himself with a ferocity that frightens all who witness it, the butler continued, his voice breaking with emotion that he normally kept carefully controlled. He believes that if he had been present, if he had not allowed pride and anger to drive him away from Ravenshollow, he might have somehow prevented her death, or at least provided her with the comfort of his presence during her final hours. The guilt eats at his soul like acid, transforming the generous and warm-hearted man we all knew into the haunted specter you see before you now. As Hartwell spoke, I found myself thinking about the cruel mathematics of love and loss, the way that timing could transform what should have been a simple business trip into a source of lifelong torment. The idea that Eleanor had died believing herself to be alone and unforgiven, while her husband raced desperately across the English countryside in a futile attempt to reach her bedside, seemed almost too tragic to bear. Yet here was the proof of that tragedy, written in the deep lines of grief that had carved themselves into the Duke's once handsome face. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the storm rage against the manor's ancient stones, I found myself thinking about the nature of guilt and redemption, about the terrible weight that unspoken words could carry across the vast divide between life and death. The wind seemed to carry voices through the corridors, whispers and sighs that spoke of longing and regret in equal measure. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed, with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested human agency, though no footsteps followed to mark the passage of any living person. The scent of roses drifted through my chamber window, impossibly strong and sweet for the depths of October, and I wondered if some loves were indeed powerful enough to transcend the boundary between the mortal world and whatever lay beyond. As sleep finally claimed me, I dreamed once again of the woman in white, but this time her face was clearer, more defined. She possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that belonged more to paintings than to life, with golden hair that seemed to capture and hold starlight, and eyes the color of summer skies. In my dream, she moved through the manor's corridors with purpose, searching for something or someone who remained forever just beyond her reach. The following morning brought with it a development that would change everything about my understanding of Ravenshollow Manor and its tragic history. I was conducting Lady Catherine's morning lessons in the bright conservatory when the child suddenly stopped in the middle of reciting her multiplication tables, her small face turning toward the glass doors that led to the garden with an expression of such intense concentration that it made my heart race with anticipation and dread. "She is trying to tell Papa something very important," Lady Catherine announced, with the matter-of-fact tone she always used when discussing her mother's visits. "But he cannot hear her because his sadness has made his ears stop working properly. She says that adults sometimes forget how to listen with their hearts instead of just their heads, and that makes it very difficult for people who live in the in-between place to communicate with those who are still fully alive." I felt a chill run down my spine as the little girl rose from her chair and walked to the conservatory doors, pressing her small hands against the glass as if she were trying to touch someone standing just on the other side. Her breath fogged the pain as she spoke, in the kind of urgent whisper that children use when they are trying very hard to make themselves understood by adults who they fear might not believe them. "Mama says you have the listening ears, Miss Whitmore," Lady Catherine continued, without turning away from the glass. "She says you lost people you loved very much, just like Papa did, and that means your heart remembers how to hear voices that other people cannot detect. She wants to know if you will help her deliver her message to Papa, because it is very important, and she has been trying for such a long time that she is becoming quite desperate." The child's words struck me with the force of a physical blow, awakening memories of my own encounters with the impossible during the darkest days following my family's death. There had been nights when I could have sworn I heard my younger sister's laughter echoing through empty rooms, mornings when the scent of my mother's lavender water seemed to linger in the air despite the fact that all her possessions had been sold to pay for their burial. I had convinced myself that grief had played tricks on my senses, but now, standing in the sun-drenched conservatory with Eleanor's daughter, I began to wonder if I had been too quick to dismiss experiences that defied rational explanation. Before I could formulate a response to Lady Catherine's extraordinary request, the conservatory door opened with a soft click, and the Duke of Ravenshollow himself stepped into the room. It was the first time I had seen him in full daylight, and the sight took my breath away for reasons that had nothing to do with supernatural phenomena. Even ravaged by grief, and dressed in unrelieved black mourning attire, he possessed the kind of masculine beauty that belonged in Renaissance paintings rather than the everyday world of Yorkshire manor houses. His dark hair, though disheveled from what appeared to be a sleepless night, caught the morning sunlight with auburn highlights that spoke of distant Spanish ancestors. His gray eyes, so like his daughter's in color but infinitely more tortured in expression, held depths of pain that no amount of time seemed capable of healing. The sharp planes of his face might have been carved by a master sculptor working in marble, save for the lines of exhaustion and sorrow that mapped the geography of his suffering with heartbreaking precision. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, in a voice that carried the cultured accents of his class, but had been roughened by months of disuse and private anguish. "I trust that Lady Catherine is proving to be a satisfactory student." His formal politeness was a barrier as impenetrable as the manor's ancient stone walls, designed to keep the world at a safe distance from his wounded heart. Lady Catherine ran to her father with the kind of desperate affection that suggested she treasured these rare moments of his attention above all earthly goods. "Papa," she exclaimed, her small voice bright with hope and excitement, "Miss Whitmore has the listening ears that Mama told us about. Perhaps she can help you hear the important message that Mama has been trying so hard to deliver. You know how much Mama loves you, and how worried she becomes when you are too sad to eat your dinner or sleep properly at night." The transformation that came over the Duke's face was as swift as it was devastating. The careful mask of polite composure cracked and fell away, revealing raw pain so intense that I had to look away from the naked agony in his eyes. His hands, which had been steady moments before, began to tremble with barely controlled emotion as he knelt down to his daughter's level, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Catherine, dearest," he whispered, his cultured accent thickened by tears that he refused to allow to fall. "Mama has gone to heaven to be with the angels. She cannot speak to us anymore, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. These conversations you believe you are having are simply your way of remembering how much she loved us both. There are no messages from beyond the grave, darling. There is only the love she left behind in our hearts, and that must be enough to sustain us through our grief." "But Papa," Lady Catherine protested with the kind of stubborn certainty that only children possess, "I see her as clearly as I see you right now. She wears her blue silk dress, the one with the tiny pearls sewn along the neckline, and she smells like the roses from her special garden. She tells me stories about when you first met, and she sings the lullaby that always helped me fall asleep when thunderstorms frightened me. How could I know these things if she was not really here to tell them to me?" The Duke's composure finally shattered completely. He pulled his daughter against his chest with such desperate intensity that I feared he might inadvertently harm the child, though his touch remained infinitely gentle, despite the violence of his emotions. Silent tears streamed down his face as he rocked back and forth, his broad shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. I found myself caught between the desire to offer comfort and the knowledge that my presence was an intrusion upon this most private of family moments. Yet something about the scene before me, something about the way the morning light seemed to shimmer and dance around the grieving father and daughter, made me reluctant to leave. The air itself felt charged with possibility, as if the very fabric of reality had grown thin in this place where love and loss intersected with such devastating intensity. As I watched, transfixed by the tableau of human suffering and devotion, the scent of roses began to fill the conservatory with such overwhelming sweetness that it became difficult to breathe normally. The fragrance was so intense, so impossibly perfect, that it seemed to have substance and weight, pressing against my skin like silk scarves moved by an unfelt breeze. Lady Catherine lifted her head from her father's shoulder and smiled with radiant joy, her small hand reaching toward something that only she could see. "Papa," she whispered with absolute certainty, "Mama is here right now. She is standing behind you, and she is trying to put her arms around both of us, but her arms go right through us because she is made of moonlight and memory now instead of flesh and blood. She wants you to know that she forgives you completely for going away to London, and that the quarrel you had about the parliamentary vote was not worth a single moment of the guilt you carry. She says her love for you is stronger than death itself, and that she will wait for you in the place where roses bloom eternal, and no winter can ever touch their petals." The Duke's entire body went rigid with shock, his tear-stained face draining of what little color it had possessed. How could Catherine know about the parliamentary vote that had driven him to London in anger? How could she know about the harsh words they had exchanged about his political duties versus his family obligations? These were private matters, intimate details of marital discord that no 5-year-old child should have been able to comprehend, much less remember with such devastating accuracy. In that moment, as father and daughter clung to each other in the rose-scented air of the conservatory, I finally understood that Ravenshollow Manor was not simply haunted by memories of the dead, but by the presence of a love so powerful that it had found a way to transcend the ultimate boundary between this world and the next. The revelation that Lady Catherine possessed knowledge of her parents' private quarrel marked the beginning of a transformation that would alter the very foundations of life at Ravenshollow Manor. In the days that followed our extraordinary encounter in the conservatory, the Duke emerged from his self-imposed isolation with the tentative steps of a man learning to walk again after a devastating injury. His grief remained a constant companion, but it no longer consumed him with the same destructive intensity that had reduced him to a shadow of his former self. I found myself occupying an increasingly central role in this delicate process of healing, serving not only as Lady Catherine's governess, but as an inadvertent bridge between the world of the living and whatever realm Eleanor now inhabited. The child's supernatural communications became more frequent and more detailed, as if her mother's spirit had been strengthened by the knowledge that someone finally believed in her presence. Through Catherine's innocent voice, Eleanor shared memories of her courtship with the Duke, intimate details of their married life, and urgent messages of love and forgiveness that gradually began to chip away at the wall of guilt that had imprisoned her husband's heart. The Duke, whose given name I learned was Alexander, began to seek out my company with increasing regularity, though he approached these conversations with the caution of a man who had been burned by hope too many times to trust it completely. We would meet in the library after Lady Catherine had been tucked into bed, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that had witnessed generations of Ashworth family secrets. The room itself seemed to encourage confidences, with its warm oak paneling and crackling fireplace creating an atmosphere of intimacy that made even the most painful revelations feel somehow bearable. During these evening encounters, Alexander would listen with rapt attention as I recounted the messages that Eleanor had conveyed through their daughter. His face, which had grown gaunt during months of self-imposed starvation and sleepless nights, slowly began to regain some of its former vitality as he absorbed each precious word from his beloved wife. The lines of suffering that had etched themselves so deeply into his features did not disappear, but they seemed to soften slightly, as if touched by the healing balm of genuine forgiveness. "Miss Whitmore," he said to me one evening as we sat before the library fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across his aristocratic features, "I find myself in the extraordinary position of owing my sanity to a woman I have known for less than a month." The formal distance he had maintained since my arrival was gradually giving way to something warmer and more genuine, though he still struggled to allow anyone too close to the wounded core of his being. I assured him that no debt existed between us, that I was simply performing my duties as a governess concerned for her charge's well-being. But even as I spoke these conventional words, I was acutely aware that my feelings for the Duke of Ravenshollow had grown far beyond the bounds of professional duty. There was something about his combination of masculine strength and vulnerable sorrow that called to the deepest parts of my own wounded heart, awakening emotions I had thought buried forever beneath the ashes of my own losses. The attraction that had begun to simmer between us was complicated by the supernatural circumstances that had brought us together, as well as by the vast social chasm that separated a duke from a governess. I was painfully aware of my position as a dependent member of his household, a woman whose very livelihood depended upon his continued goodwill and patronage. Yet in those quiet evening hours, when the rest of the manor slept, when the barriers of class and circumstance seemed temporarily suspended by our shared concern for Lady Catherine's unusual gifts, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps love could indeed transcend the artificial boundaries imposed by society. Eleanor herself seemed to approve of the growing connection between her husband and the woman who had become her earthly voice. Through Lady Catherine, she expressed gratitude for my presence at Ravenshollow and encouraged both Alexander and me to find solace in each other's company. She spoke of the loneliness that had consumed the manor since her death, of her concern for her daughter's emotional development in such an atmosphere of perpetual mourning, and of her desire to see her beloved husband learn to live again rather than simply exist in a state of suspended animation. One particularly memorable evening, as autumn deepened into the promise of winter and the first snow began to dust the Yorkshire moors, Eleanor delivered a message that would forever alter the dynamic between Alexander and myself. Lady Catherine had been unusually restless during her bedtime routine, claiming that her mother was trying to communicate something of vital importance. I had agreed to sit with the child until she fell asleep, and it was during this vigil that Eleanor's spirit made her most direct intervention in our earthly affairs. "Mama says that Papa must not feel guilty about finding comfort with you," Lady Catherine announced with the matter-of-fact tone she always used for these supernatural communications. "She says that love is like a garden that grows more beautiful when it is shared, not less, and that the heart has room for many different kinds of affection without any of them diminishing the others. She wants Papa to know that she approves of the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, and she hopes that you will help him remember how to smile again." The implications of this message sent shockwaves through my entire being. I had believed my growing feelings for Alexander to be carefully concealed, yet apparently even the dead could perceive the subtle signs of a heart learning to love again. The knowledge that Eleanor not only knew of my affection for her husband, but actually blessed it filled me with a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and profound confusion about the ethics of falling in love with a widower whose wife still maintained an active presence in his daily life. When I conveyed Eleanor's message to Alexander the following evening, his reaction was even more intense than my own had been. He rose from his chair before the fireplace and began to pace the length of the library with the restless energy of a caged predator, his hands clasped behind his back as he struggled to process the implications of his dead wife's supernatural matchmaking. "Margaret," he said, and the sound of my given name on his lips sent shivers of awareness through every nerve in my body. I must confess that Eleanor's message comes as both a relief and a source of considerable guilt. I have indeed found myself drawn to you in ways that seem almost a betrayal of her memory. Yet I cannot deny the comfort your presence has brought to both Catherine and myself. You have restored something to this house that I feared was lost forever when Eleanor drew her final breath." His voice broke slightly as he continued, the careful composure he usually maintained crumbling under the weight of emotions too powerful to be contained. "I loved my wife with every fiber of my being, and I believed that such love could exist only once in a man's lifetime. Yet here I stand, barely 6 months after her death, finding myself capable of feelings I thought had died with her. How am I to reconcile this apparent inconstancy with the vows I made before God to love and honor her until death parted us?" I rose from my own chair and moved toward him, drawn by an irresistible impulse to offer comfort to this man who carried such unnecessary guilt for the simple crime of possessing a heart capable of healing. When I placed my hand gently upon his arm, he stopped his restless pacing and turned to face me, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "Alexander," I whispered, allowing myself the liberty of using his given name for the first time. "Eleanor herself has told us that love multiplies rather than divides when it is shared freely. Perhaps what you perceive as inconstancy is actually proof of the depth and generosity of your capacity for devotion. A heart that can love so completely that it transcends death is surely capable of loving again without diminishing what came before." For a moment, we stood frozen in tableau, my hand on his arm and his eyes searching my face as if he could find the answers to all his questions written there. The silence between us was charged with possibility, heavy with unspoken desires and the weight of supernatural blessing from beyond the grave. Then, with a gentleness that spoke of infinite tenderness and barely controlled longing, he raised his free hand to cup my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with a touch so light it might have been a dream. "Margaret," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion, "I fear I am falling in love with you, and I do not know whether to rejoice in this unexpected gift or to flee from it before it can cause us both irreparable harm. You deserve so much more than a broken man haunted by ghosts. Yet I find myself hoping against hope that you might somehow find it possible to care for such a damaged soul." My response was cut short by the sudden appearance of Lady Catherine in the library doorway, her small figure ghostly in her white nightgown and her dark eyes wide with excitement. She ran toward us with the urgency of a child bearing momentous news, her bare feet silent on the thick Persian carpet that covered the floor. "Papa, Miss Whitmore," she exclaimed breathlessly. "Mama says you must go to her rose garden right now, immediately, because something very important is about to happen. She says the veil between her world and ours is thinnest when the first snow falls, and that tonight she will be able to show herself to you both if you are brave enough to look with your hearts instead of your eyes." Alexander and I exchanged glances filled with equal parts anticipation and trepidation. The idea of actually seeing Eleanor's spirit, of receiving her blessing directly rather than through the medium of a 5-year-old child, was both thrilling and terrifying. Yet we found ourselves moving toward the library windows without conscious decision, drawn by forces beyond our understanding to witness whatever supernatural revelation awaited us in the garden where Eleanor's impossible roses continued to bloom despite the onset of winter. Through the tall windows, we could see the garden clearly in the silvery moonlight that turned the falling snow into dancing spirits of its own. The rose bushes stood in defiant bloom, their crimson petals a shocking splash of color against the white landscape, And there, moving among the flowers with the grace of a woman born to such beauty, was a figure in flowing white that seemed to be composed of moonlight and memory made manifest. Eleanor's spirit was more beautiful than any painting could have captured. With golden hair that moved in a breeze that touched nothing else in the garden, and eyes that shone with love transcendent and eternal. She moved toward the windows where we stood transfixed, her expression radiant with joy as she saw that we could finally perceive her true form. When she reached the glass, she placed one translucent hand against the pane, and Alexander pressed his palm against the opposite side, separated from his beloved wife by nothing more than a few inches of glass and the immutable barrier between life and death. For several minutes, they communicated in a language that required no words, a conversation conducted entirely through expressions of love, forgiveness, and eternal devotion. Then Eleanor turned her luminous gaze upon me, and her smile was so warm and welcoming that I felt tears of gratitude streaming down my cheeks. She gestured for me to approach, and when I placed my own hand beside Alexander's, she covered it with her free hand, blessing our union with a touch that transcended the physical world. When Eleanor finally began to fade back into the moonlight from which she had emerged, her lips formed words that we heard not with our ears but with our hearts, a final message of love and release that would forever change the course of our earthly lives. She released Alexander from his vows of eternal mourning and gave us both permission to build a new happiness upon the foundation of the love she had left behind. And then she was gone, leaving only the scent of roses and the memory of supernatural grace to mark her passage between worlds. The morning after our supernatural encounter in Eleanor's rose garden brought with it a transformation so profound that it seemed as if Ravenshollow Manor itself had awakened from a long and troubled sleep. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been shrouded in perpetual gloom for months, and the oppressive atmosphere that had weighed upon the household like a funeral shroud began to lift with each passing hour. Even the servants moved with lighter steps, as if they could sense that some fundamental shift had occurred in the spiritual landscape of their world. Alexander appeared at breakfast, looking more rested than I had ever seen him, the deep shadows beneath his eyes finally beginning to fade after months of tormented sleeplessness. He wore a dark gray morning coat rather than the unrelieved black that had become his uniform of mourning, and though the change was subtle, it spoke volumes about his gradually evolving relationship with grief. When he smiled at Lady Catherine over his morning coffee, the expression reached his eyes for the first time since my arrival at the manor. Lady Catherine herself seemed positively radiant, her small face glowing with the satisfaction of a child whose most fervent prayers have been answered. She chattered happily throughout the meal, regaling us with detailed descriptions of the beautiful lady in white who had visited her dreams to express gratitude for bringing her papa and Miss Whitmore together in the garden. According to the child's account, Eleanor had appeared more solid and vibrant than ever before, as if the act of revealing herself to both Alexander and myself had somehow strengthened her connection to our world. "Mama says she can rest peacefully now," Lady Catherine announced with the matter-of-fact tone she always used for supernatural communications. "She knows that Papa will not be alone anymore, and that you will take very good care of both of us, Miss Whitmore. She also says that the roses in her garden will bloom for one more week, long enough for you and Papa to be married beneath them, and then they will sleep until spring comes again and everything is as it should be." The casual mention of marriage sent a flush of heat through my entire being, though whether from embarrassment or anticipation, I could not have said. Alexander and I had not yet spoken of such practical matters as matrimony, though the attraction that had been building between us for weeks had been given supernatural blessing by Eleanor's spirit. The social complications of a duke marrying his daughter's governess remained as daunting as ever. But in the warm glow of the morning sun streaming through Ravenshollow's ancient windows, such obstacles seemed surmountable rather than insurmountable. Alexander reached across the breakfast table to cover my hand with his own, his gray eyes reflecting a warmth that had been absent since Eleanor's death. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice rich with emotion barely held in check, "if you would do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, I believe we could create something beautiful from the ashes of our respective sorrows. I cannot promise you the passionate innocence of a first love, for that belongs eternally to Eleanor, but I can offer you a devotion that has been tested by loss and emerged stronger for the trial." Before I could respond to this unexpected proposal, the morning tranquility was shattered by the arrival of an elegant carriage bearing the coat of arms of the Earl of Pemberton. Through the dining-room windows, I watched as a tall, distinguished gentleman in his 50s emerged from the vehicle, followed by a strikingly beautiful young woman whose fashionable London attire marked her immediately as someone of considerable social standing. The man's resemblance to Alexander was unmistakable, though his features lacked the aristocratic refinement that made the Duke so devastatingly handsome. "That is my uncle, Lord Pemberton, and my cousin Victoria," Alexander explained with a note of resignation in his voice. "I had written to inform them of my intention to emerge from mourning, but I did not expect them to descend upon us quite so quickly. Uncle Charles has been handling many of my business affairs during my period of incapacity, and Victoria has been vocal in her concern about Catherine's upbringing in what she considers an unhealthy atmosphere of perpetual grief. The implications of this unexpected visit sent a chill of foreboding through my veins. I was acutely aware that my position as governess, while respectable, hardly qualified me to move in the elevated social circles that the Duke of Ravenshollow naturally inhabited. The arrival of his aristocratic relatives would undoubtedly complicate any plans for our union, particularly if they harbored ambitions for Alexander to make a more socially advantageous match with someone of his own elevated station. Within minutes, Hartwell appeared to announce the visitors, his expression carefully neutral as he informed Alexander that Lord Pemberton requested an immediate private audience on matters of utmost urgency. The Earl swept into the dining room with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the domestic scene before him with calculating precision. "Alexander, my dear boy," Lord Pemberton boomed in the hearty voice of a man who had spent years in Parliament, "it does my heart good to see you looking so much more like yourself. When I received your letter mentioning your intention to re-enter society, I knew I must come at once to offer whatever assistance might be required, and this charming young person must be the governess you mentioned in your correspondence." His gaze fell upon me with the kind of dismissive assessment that clearly categorized me as a servant, albeit a well-educated one. I rose from my chair and curtsied appropriately, though I could not entirely suppress the flash of rebellion that sparked in my eyes at being so casually dismissed. Lady Catherine, displaying the perfect manners that had been drilled into her since birth, greeted her great-uncle and cousin with polite enthusiasm, though I noticed that she positioned herself closer to me than to the visitors. Victoria Ashworth was everything that I was not, a perfect example of the kind of woman who belonged naturally in Alexander's world. Her auburn hair was arranged in the latest London fashion, her emerald silk morning dress had clearly been created by one of the city's most exclusive modistes, and her manner combined aristocratic confidence with feminine charm in precisely the proportions that made gentlemen forget their own names. When she smiled at Alexander, her expression held a familiarity that spoke of shared childhood memories and mutual social understanding. "Dear Alexander," she murmured in a voice like honey poured over velvet, "you cannot imagine how relieved we all are to see you beginning to recover from your terrible loss. Eleanor was such a treasure, and we have all mourned her passing most deeply. But life must go on, and there are certain responsibilities that cannot be indefinitely postponed, particularly where little Catherine's future is concerned." The subtle emphasis she placed on the word responsibilities sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. I had heard enough conversations among the servants to know that Alexander's prolonged mourning had created something of a crisis in the management of his vast estates and political obligations. His uncle had apparently been handling many of these duties during the past 6 months, but such an arrangement could not continue indefinitely without raising questions about the Duke's fitness to manage his own affairs. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat with the authority of a man preparing to deliver pronouncements of great importance. "Alexander," he began in tones that brooked no contradiction, "I must speak frankly about certain matters that can no longer be delayed. Your absence from London society has been noted by all the right people, and there are whispers beginning to circulate about your continued competence to manage your parliamentary duties and financial responsibilities. What you need, my boy, is to demonstrate your complete recovery by making a brilliant marriage that will restore confidence in your judgment and stability." His eyes moved meaningfully toward Victoria, whose cheeks had developed a becoming flush that suggested she was not entirely displeased by the direction of the conversation. I felt my heart begin to race with a combination of fear and indignation as I realized the true purpose of this visit. Lord Pemberton had not come to celebrate Alexander's recovery from grief, but to engineer a marriage that would serve the family's political and social interests while ensuring that the Ashworth bloodline continued through an appropriately aristocratic union. Victoria and Alexander had been childhood playmates. As I understand it, Lord Pemberton continued with the satisfied air of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as anticipated. Their families have been allied for generations, and a match between them would unite two of England's most distinguished noble houses while providing Catherine with a mother who truly understands the obligations that come with their elevated station. Victoria has waited patiently through your period of mourning, and I believe she would be amenable to a proposal that would benefit everyone concerned. The casual way in which my own feelings and Alexander's wishes were dismissed in favor of political expediency struck me like a physical blow. I could see the conflict raging in Alexander's gray eyes as he struggled between his newfound happiness and the crushing weight of family expectations and social obligation. Lady Catherine had gone very still beside me, her small hand creeping into mine as if she sensed that forces beyond her understanding were threatening to tear apart the fragile peace that had been so recently established at Ravenshollow Manor. "Uncle Charles," Alexander said finally, his voice carefully controlled but edged with steel, "I appreciate your concern for both my well-being and the family's reputation. However, I must inform you that I have already made certain commitments that would make the arrangement you propose quite impossible to fulfill. Miss Whitmore has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage, and I have no intention of allowing considerations of social advantage to override matters of genuine affection and compatibility." The silence that followed this announcement was so complete that I could hear the ticking of the mantelpiece clock with supernatural clarity. Lord Pemberton's face went through a series of expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to barely controlled fury, while Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked just enough to reveal the wounded vanity of a woman who had clearly expected to receive a proposal rather than witness one being defended. "Alexander," Lord Pemberton said, in a voice that had dropped to dangerously quiet levels, "surely you cannot be serious about marrying a governess. I understand that Miss Whitmore appears to be a perfectly respectable young woman, but such a union would be absolutely ruinous to your standing in society. Think of your political career, your financial obligations, the example you must set for Catherine. A duke cannot simply marry for sentiment without considering the broader implications of such a choice." The word governess was pronounced with such disdain that it might have been a curse, and I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation at being discussed as if I were not present in the room. Yet Alexander's hand tightened over mine with reassuring pressure, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the authority of his ancient title and considerable personal fortune. "I have given considerable thought to all the implications you mention, Uncle, and I remain convinced that Miss Whitmore will make an exemplary Duchess of Ravenshollow. She has already proven her devotion to Catherine's welfare, her intelligence is beyond question, and her character possesses a strength that has been tested by genuine adversity. As for my political career, I believe the voters of Yorkshire will respect a man who chooses love over calculating ambition, and my financial affairs are more than stable enough to weather any temporary social displeasure." Victoria finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly with emotions she was struggling to control. "Alexander," she said with what remained of her aristocratic composure, "surely you realize that your attachment to Miss Whitmore is simply a natural result of your grief and isolation. When you return to London society and see how impossible such a marriage would be, you will thank us for preventing you from making a decision that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Miss Whitmore herself must understand that accepting such a proposal would be tantamount to social suicide for both of you." Before I could formulate a response to this subtle attack on both my character and my judgment, Lady Catherine stepped forward with the fearless courage that only children possess when defending those they love. her small chin lifted with unmistakable determination as she faced the adults who seemed intent on destroying her newly restored happiness. "My mama likes Miss Whitmore very much," she announced with perfect clarity and devastating innocence. "She told me last night that Miss Whitmore has a good heart and will make Papa very happy, which is the most important thing of all. Mama also said that people who care more about what other people think than about love are very silly indeed, and that Papa should marry whomever makes him smile the way Mama used to do." The mention of Eleanor's supernatural approval sent another shockwave through the assembled company, though for very different reasons than Lady Catherine intended. Lord Pemberton and Victoria clearly assumed that the child was simply repeating adult conversations she had overheard, but Alexander and I knew better. Eleanor's spirit had indeed given her blessing to our union, and her daughter was now serving as her earthly advocate in the face of family opposition. The battle lines were drawn, and I realized that the struggle for Alexander's heart and hand would require all the courage and determination I could muster. The forces arrayed against us were formidable, but we had something that Lord Pemberton and Victoria lacked: the blessing of true love, both earthly and eternal, and the unwavering support of a little girl whose connection to the spiritual realm made her the most powerful ally we could possibly hope to possess. The week that followed Lord Pemberton's ultimatum was perhaps the most tumultuous in the entire history of Ravenshollow Manor, as forces both earthly and supernatural aligned themselves for a final confrontation that would determine the fate of all who dwelt within its ancient walls. The Earl had not departed after delivering his pronouncement about Alexander's unsuitable choice of bride, but had instead established himself and Victoria in the Manor's guest quarters, with the clear intention of wearing down our resistance through a campaign of persistent social pressure and emotional manipulation. Each morning brought fresh arguments about duty and propriety, delivered with the relentless precision of artillery bombardment. Lord Pemberton marshaled every weapon in his considerable arsenal of persuasion, from threats about Alexander's political future to dire predictions about Lady Catherine's social prospects as the stepdaughter of a former governess. Victoria employed more subtle tactics, reminiscing about shared childhood memories and painting seductive pictures of the brilliant London season they could enjoy together once their inevitable engagement was announced. Yet for every earthly argument they presented, Eleanor's spirit provided supernatural counterbalance through increasingly frequent communications with her daughter. Lady Catherine became our most stalwart defender, relaying her mother's messages with the fearless determination of a child who knew herself to be fighting on the side of righteousness. Eleanor spoke of love's triumph over social convention, of the hollow nature of marriages built on political convenience rather than genuine affection, and of her absolute certainty that I possessed both the strength of character and depth of feeling necessary to make Alexander truly happy. Alexander himself bore the brunt of his family's disapproval with magnificent dignity, though I could see the strain beginning to tell in the return of those familiar shadows beneath his eyes. The weight of centuries of aristocratic tradition pressed down upon his shoulders like a physical burden, and I began to fear that even his love for me might not prove strong enough to withstand such relentless opposition from those whose approval he had been taught from childhood to value above all else. It was Victoria who finally overplayed her hand, setting in motion the chain of events that would resolve our situation in a manner none of us could have anticipated. On the 6th day of their visit, she cornered me in the conservatory where Lady Catherine and I were conducting our afternoon lessons, her beautiful face twisted with barely controlled frustration at the failure of her carefully orchestrated campaign to win back Alexander's affections. "Miss Whitmore," she began with the false sweetness of honey poured over poison, "surely you must see how impossible this situation has become. Alexander believes himself to be in love with you, but such feelings are merely the product of grief and isolation. Once he returns to London and resumes his proper place in society, he will realize that his infatuation was nothing more than a temporary aberration brought on by emotional distress. You would be doing us all a kindness by withdrawing gracefully before real damage is done to his reputation and standing." Her words struck at my deepest fears and insecurities, the voice of doubt that whispered in my darkest moments that a duke's governess had no right to aspire to such elevated happiness. Yet as I looked at Lady Catherine's trusting face, remembering all the supernatural interventions that had brought Alexander and me together. I found reserves of courage I had not known I possessed. "Miss Ashworth," I replied with dignity that surprised even myself, "I would indeed withdraw from this situation if I believed that doing so would truly serve Alexander's best interests. However, I have seen him transform from a broken man consumed by guilt into someone capable of joy and hope once again. If that transformation is merely the product of temporary infatuation, then time will reveal the truth without any interference from either of us. Until then, I intend to trust in the love we have discovered and the blessing it has received from sources beyond this earthly realm." Victoria's carefully controlled composure finally cracked completely, revealing the spoiled aristocrat beneath the polished exterior. She had clearly expected me to crumble under pressure, to slink away like a properly chastened servant who had forgotten her place in the social order. My refusal to play the role of humble penitent transformed her frustration into something approaching fury. "You speak of supernatural blessings as if you were some sort of mystic rather than a governess trading on a grieving man's emotional weakness," she hissed with venomous precision. "These ridiculous stories about Eleanor's spirit are nothing more than a child's fantasy encouraged by an opportunistic woman seeking to elevate herself through manipulation and deceit. No dead woman gives permission for her husband to remarry, Miss Whitmore. Such decisions belong to the living, and the living members of this family have made their preferences abundantly clear." Lady Catherine had been sitting quietly at her small desk throughout this exchange, but Victoria's attack on her mother's memory and her own supernatural experiences proved to be the final provocation the child was willing to endure. She rose from her chair with the majestic dignity of a queen defending her realm, her gray eyes blazing with indignation that would have been magnificent in a grown woman and was absolutely formidable in a 5-year-old girl. "My mother is not dead in the way you mean," Lady Catherine announced with crystalline clarity and devastating conviction. "She lives in the place where love goes when it cannot stay in the world anymore, and she visits me whenever I need her most. She does not like you very much, Cousin Victoria, because you say cruel things about people you do not understand, and you try to make Papa choose duty over happiness. Mama says that people who cannot believe in love that lasts beyond death are very sad indeed, and that she feels sorry for you because your heart is too small to hold anything bigger than your own wants." The child's words hung in the air like a benediction and a judgment combined, carrying such weight of certainty that even Victoria seemed momentarily stunned into silence. But it was what happened next that transformed our drawing room confrontation into something approaching the miraculous, proving once and for all that Eleanor's presence at Ravenshollow Manor was far more than the product of a child's imagination or a governess's manipulation. As we stood frozen in tableau, the conservatory began to fill with the scent of roses so intense it seemed to have physical substance. The fragrance was accompanied by a subtle change in the quality of light streaming through the tall windows, as if the very air had become luminous with supernatural presence. Lady Catherine smiled with radiant joy and reached towards something that only she could see. But this time Victoria gasped and stepped backward, her face draining of all color as she stared at what appeared to be empty space beside Eleanor's daughter. "Mama says you can see her now too, if you really look," Lady Catherine said with matter-of-fact triumph. "She says that sometimes people who do not believe in anything bigger than themselves need proof that love never really dies, and that you are about to receive such proof whether you want it or not." Victoria's eyes widened with shock and something approaching terror as a figure began to materialize in the rose-scented air before us. Eleanor's spirit appeared more solid and radiant than I had ever seen her, dressed in the blue silk gown that Lady Catherine had described so often, with golden hair that seemed to capture and hold the afternoon sunlight. Her expression was serene but implacable as she regarded the woman who had sought to destroy the happiness she had worked so hard to create for her beloved husband. When Eleanor spoke, her voice carried the authority of love that had transcended death itself, and every word fell into the stunned silence like drops of liquid silver. "Victoria," she said with gentle but inexorable firmness, "you have allowed pride and wounded vanity to cloud your judgment about what is truly best for my family. Alexander deserves to love and be loved again, and Margaret possesses the strength of heart necessary to help him heal from the wounds that my death inflicted upon his soul. I give them my blessing freely and completely, and I ask that you do the same, rather than allowing bitterness to poison what should be a time of joy and renewal." Victoria swayed as if she had been physically struck, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror as she found herself confronted with irrefutable proof of everything she had dismissed as fantasy and manipulation. The carefully constructed worldview that had sustained her through years of aristocratic privilege crumbled in the face of supernatural reality, leaving her defenseless against truths that challenged every assumption she had ever made about the nature of life and death. "This is impossible," she whispered in a voice barely audible above the sound of her own rapid breathing. "Dead people do not appear to offer marriage advice. Ghosts do not materialize in conservatories to defend governesses against their social betters. Such things simply do not happen in the rational world of educated people." Eleanor's luminous smile grew warmer as she regarded Victoria with the patience of one who had learned to see beyond the limitations of earthly understanding. "My dear child," she replied with infinite compassion, "the rational world of educated people is far smaller and more limited than you have been taught to believe. Love is the most powerful force in any universe, visible or invisible, and it creates possibilities that transcend every rule that mortals use to explain their existence. I have lingered in the space between worlds, not because I cannot find peace, but because my love for Alexander and Catherine required me to ensure their happiness before I could move on to whatever comes next." The spirit turned her attention to me, and her expression grew even more tender as she spoke words that would forever change my understanding of my place in the cosmic order of things. "Margaret, you have been more than a governess to my daughter, and more than a comfort to my husband. You have been an instrument of healing sent by forces greater than any of us can comprehend, and your love has proven strong enough to bridge the gap between this world and the next. Accept Alexander's proposal with my complete blessing, knowing that you will never be replacing me, but rather continuing the work of love that I began and must now entrust to your capable hands." As Eleanor's spirit began to fade back into the luminous air from which she had emerged, she delivered one final message that would resolve all remaining doubts about the wisdom of our union. "Tell Alexander that I release him from mourning and bid him to embrace the future with courage rather than guilt. Tell him that our love will endure in Catherine's laughter and in the roses that will bloom each spring in the garden we planted together. And tell him that the woman who bears his name and shares his life has been chosen not by social convention or family pressure, but by the eternal laws that govern matters of the heart." When Eleanor's presence finally disappeared entirely, leaving only the lingering scent of roses and the memory of supernatural grace, Victoria collapsed into the nearest chair, as if her legs could no longer support the weight of her shattered assumptions about reality. She stared at the space where Eleanor had stood with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had been fundamentally altered in the span of a few moments. I helped the trembling woman to her feet and guided her toward the morning room, where I encouraged her to rest, while I sought Alexander to report on the extraordinary events that had just transpired. When I found him in the library with Lord Pemberton, both men took one look at my face and immediately demanded to know what had occurred to leave me in such a state of shocked exhilaration. Alexander's response to Eleanor's final message was everything I could have hoped for and more. He swept me into his arms with passionate gratitude, spinning me around the library as if we were dancing to music only we could hear. When he finally set me down, his gray eyes were bright with tears of joy and relief as he declared his intention to marry me immediately, before any other earthly or supernatural forces could intervene to complicate our happiness. Lord Pemberton, faced with his daughter's incoherent testimony about supernatural visitations and his nephew's absolute determination to marry for love rather than social advantage, finally conceded defeat with as much grace as his wounded pride would allow. He announced his intention to return to London immediately, taking Victoria with him to recover from what he diplomatically termed her nervous exhaustion brought on by the shock of witnessing Alexander's complete recovery from grief. 3 days later, as Eleanor's roses bloomed with impossible beauty in the first snow of winter, Alexander and I were married in the manor's ancient chapel, by a rector who asked no questions about the supernatural circumstances that had brought us together. Lady Catherine served as our flower girl, scattering rose petals that should not have existed in such weather along the aisle where her parents had walked on their own wedding day years before. As we spoke our vows before God and family, I felt Eleanor's presence surrounding us with warmth and blessing, and I knew that our love had been sanctified not only by earthly ceremony, but by forces that transcended the boundary between life and death. The roses in Eleanor's garden bloomed for exactly 1 week after our wedding, just as she had promised through Lady Catherine, and then they peacefully entered their winter sleep, secure in the knowledge that spring would bring renewal and the continuation of love's eternal cycle. Alexander and I built our happiness on the foundation of supernatural blessing and earthly devotion combined, creating a marriage that honored both the past and the future while embracing the miraculous possibility that love could indeed triumph over every obstacle that society and death itself could place in its path. Lady Catherine grew into a young woman blessed with both her mother's spiritual sensitivity and her father's strength of character, always knowing that she carried within herself the living bridge between two worlds and two great loves that had shaped her destiny. And sometimes, on still spring mornings, when the roses bloomed with a special beauty in Eleanor's garden, we could feel her presence still watching over the happiness she had worked so hard to create, a guardian angel whose love had proven stronger than death and whose blessing would protect our family through all the years to come.